Thank you, Teresa. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my sincere pleasure to talk about trade and investments in the framework of today's conference, Challenges of a Multipolar World. I will structure my presentation in 4 parts. Firstly, I touch on the megatrends of globalization. As Teresa just mentioned, we have seen a few profound changes, but also some trends which go back quite a few years. And the big question is whether we are at crossroads of some of the tendencies we have seen in the past years. Secondly, this is going to the core of our book, which I have written together with my co-authors, Dr. Stefan Bergamin and Dr. Bruno Glaus. We have analyzed 9 companies, Swiss companies, in their quest for digital business models. We have looked particularly at traditional companies, what they are doing going forward to rope in the younger customers, being more agile, more digital savvy, and what's to be done out of a relatively small economy, companies starting their quest for the digital business model. Then next, I touch on the US-China trade war, impact of the coronavirus crisis. Also based on our research, we found there are some profound changes as a small economy, companies operating from the base in Switzerland have to reckon with, and I think probably also have to consider in designing their future strategies. And lastly, I will do a summary, and I sum up then my presentation of about 25 minutes, 30 minutes with the implications for trade and investments for Europe and Switzerland. The megatrends in globalization, I'm sure you are more than familiar, so I'm not going to touch too long on this chart, but let me just really outline the major increase of international connections, international segregation of labor, and the kind of stellar increase of cross-border trade we have seen over the last 30 years. There is, I think, a natural tendency because we have new communication tools, we have better cooperation possibilities, we had stellar frameworks in the world to actually foster this segregation of work and form new value chains. And certainly we also had the second point about, some support by relatively cheap financing in the framework of quantitative easing and also the recent fiscal stimulus we have seen in the aftermath of the coronavirus crisis. But I think there was really one factor which we should not underestimate why, and I'll show you in the next chart, why we have seen such a major increase in cross-border trade. And this is certainly the fact that China opened up its economy to some more market-oriented principles in the 80s and entered the World Trade Organization in 2001. And this was certainly the kickoff of a new segregation of work between the more mature economies in the US and in Europe, and obviously an aspiring new nation with a clear industrial policy and now being even dubbed as the workshop of the world. So we have seen certainly a major reorientation of manufacturing in the world, and this obviously in turn then has also given rise to new trading patterns. The trading systems, and this is I think a bit new, with the exchange between US and China, let me say it this way, that the rule-based trading system came somewhat under scrutiny and also under pressure. They are slowly, as we all can basically see in the world, losing their grip, and the big nations have actually more to say and probably bully themselves also in certain aspects about how they see their interest being put through by doing it on their own way. And very new, a couple of years back now, with this Mr. Trump coming to office, that actually we have seen that the tariffs are being re-employed, and not only just for maybe aspiring to new benefits in the trading affairs, but also to pushing through certain geopolitical goals. And lastly, and this I think it's really also propelled by now the coronavirus safety concerns. We have seen that we have a certain trend now, and this is really new, that we witness some continental trading zones which are formed around large core countries. Again, probably the kickoff of such a trend was the exchange between US and China, but also on the other hand, I think it was, at least to me, but probably also for other observers, relatively surprising, the major stand Europe has taken against Britain in their Brexit negotiations. And I think also for Switzerland, it's a bit of an uneasy situation right now to be confronted with a much more assertive Europe than probably I've seen in the last 10 years or so. Now, speaking in numbers, just what I've kind of outlined, it's quite interesting to see, and this chart is not absolutely to scale. You see the 30 years here is compressed into kind of 10 bar charts, where we have then year on year from 2010 onwards to 2020. And what is really remarkable, and I think this is really something we need to keep in mind, is that with the opening up of China's economy, with the quantitative easing, with the business models of many multinational companies becoming much more international, the last 30 years up to 2010 really basically provided the background for a stellar rise in international trade. But since 2010, it's kind of flattening out. Of course, this is a proxy of international connections. They are there, they're here to stay. We are still on a very high level, but we do not have the same dynamics as what we have seen from 1980 to 2010. It's much more a flatter development right now. You also see here that the beneficiaries, and here I come to Switzerland, of this globalization, of this new kind of blueprint of how value chains are formed, the smaller nations who were very flexible, probably also were engaged in best quality services and setting standards in excellent production principles, had also clusters of industry like Switzerland, farm industry, machinery industry, watch industries, obviously had a lot of niches to opening up for them in an generally opening up of a world. However, I think at this present moment, when we see now trends of trade being flattening out, we also need to consider, I think, in terms of the position of Switzerland, whether these trends are not at least a little bit dented, or maybe whether they are actually are running out of their dynamics for a smaller economy. And this is a study which was commissioned by American Chamber of Commerce, and McKinsey has done it, and it's 2-3 years old. Nevertheless, you see that the Switzerland's attractiveness as a location for global companies has relatively declined. And what is quite interesting is that the contributing factors here were named. The unresolved relationship with the European Union, a strongly regulated domestic product market with complex tariffs, and a small domestic market. I would argue before 2010, probably these factors would not have been here on the list as major problematic areas for a small economy like Switzerland. But here it comes in with some kind of digitalization of our business models. And I think the market size starts to matter. And also that actually a new communication way to talk to the customers is being proposed by digital means. And you see here that probably, you know, to be kind of everybody's darling and small is beautiful in digital ages, I think for smaller companies, smaller countries like Switzerland, it's something to really reconsider and probably also reassess of how the strengths can come to play in the future time. Now, here this brings me to the mega trends of digitalization. It's really a profound change, and we should not underestimate. And obviously, I have the pleasure to teach here at the university. I'm kind of having the chance to talk and interact and learn also from our students every day. It's a different communication. I mean, if you go via social media, the way I communicate with students where email becomes already a bit old-fashioned, it's quite striking of how also obviously the new aspiring customers are being informed and are being also contacted directly by companies, and obviously the customers also take very much informed decisions by vetting their own information and also interacting with their peers in a way I would argue we have not seen in the past. The other side, obviously, the sharing economy. I have had a student of mine who did an excellent master thesis on luxury watches, and it's really fascinating to see how customers actually share the precious luxury watches these days cross-border and exchange information about this luxury product without actually possessing that particular product. And also, and you also see actually what a kind of a market is now being created by selling pre-owned certified watches, for example. Then clearly the digital economy, the integrated information and the cashless economy. I'll show you just a picture of a big market in a minute. And this trend that many companies are really looking now for direct contacting their customers via platforms and social media. Obviously, a trend which just has been propelled so much by the impact of the coronavirus crisis. And maybe just give you an example also of my work experience like 2 years ago when I was teaching my module Business in Emerging Markets. I have normally 30% of my 40 students are international, coming from all walks of the world, like Canada, US, Australia, China, even Tokyo at the time. And within a week's time, there were all students were basically flown home by their national carriers. They all opened up their videos in their home office across the world. And actually, I could teach in 10 days again, as we would have been in the lecture room here in Winterthur. And they also did just 6 weeks later their presentations on the semester work as if we would be in a lecture room. It was really a kind of a eye-opening experience of how generations learn very quickly if they have to. And I have certainly not been at the front of these video conferencing tools, but it was really learning by doing it. It was amazing to see also how much my generation could learn real online and real time from the students actually make this semester work in the first semester 2020. Just to give you a bit of an illustration of how I see that we really started here our global economy and also synchronized across the cross borders actually into the digital age by way of this corona crisis. Now, this is a proxy. I think it's very relevant in a way. Obviously, it's not 100% accurate, and maybe there's also some different interpretation. but we have seen the rise of trade in basically the 80s to the 2010, a little bit later, but still a stellar rise here. We see in the number of the mobile phones across the world, and you see also now probably a start of the beginning of the curve flattening, but we are now at the point where almost every citizen on this planet has actually a mobile connection somewhere. It's not necessarily smartphone, but we have about 8 billion connections around the globe in the year 2020. And what is quite also interesting, and I think relevant also for us here in Switzerland, of course we have niches, of course we have specialties. We are not there to conquer the world, no way to say that. But on the other hand, I think also it's important to keep a bit in mind of what the megatrends are, and also what the world could look like when we come out of this pandemic, and what then the dynamics of doing business are at that time. And what you now see, almost half of the population in the world, they possess already a smartphone, so they can interact digital. They are on social media. They can be being contacted by companies directly. And almost like half, 1.5 billion smartphones in 2021 are now in India and in China. In China, actually, 85% of the population own a smartphone. Life is almost impossible, as I experienced when I could travel to China on a regular basis up to 2 years ago. Cash is not anymore king, but you need the smartphone to even do daily contacts, ordering taxes, and also pay. And in India, that rate is 50%. So there are very large consumer goods entering the market. And I think also it's probably fair to say that these countries, will be very much self-assured, also actually probably putting up their stamp on the economic order of how they see it when actually these consumers are being contacted also by Western companies. Now, the next picture just illustrates, this is my last study trip to China in Chongqing. Obviously, it's 2 years ago, but how these ubiquitous WeChat systems enters all walks of life. On the right-hand side, you see my then assistant. He had WeChat. For me, it was not so easy to download. It obviously did work without any electricity on this food stand. But it's also clear that obviously data is becoming the new gold. And interesting enough, and I would argue this very strongly, I think there we need to really observe in future the double play between companies and the governments in terms of interest and also in terms of support of how this infrastructure and how this data is being managed and going forward, to the good and the bad, obviously, for the single consumers. Now, just a quick illustration also. I think I'm not going to talk long about this. You know how much e-commerce, obviously, particularly during the Corona crisis, increased. You see also on the right-hand side here, I just mark it in a minute, like here. This is the share, the orange part, about 25% of total retail sales in the US are at this point in time e-commerce sales, still 75% not. And yet you see in 2009 and also beyond that, this stellar increase in terms of e-commerce. So these digital business models, they are absolutely paramount important to be successful in future. And I think definitely every company now is putting a lot of effort and a lot of brain power, and also in terms of strategic alliance of where to go and what are the possible opportunities going forward. And on this note, I would like to introduce here our research we have done in Switzerland, together with my colleagues Stefan Bergin and Bruno Klaus. We had the pleasure in talking, actually interestingly, before and just during the start of the Corona crisis with 9 Swiss-based companies of different industries and different sizes. And what we tried to do, apologies for the access being named here in German, but I'm sure you can understand the logic. I will talk to this in just in English. And also we have first on the vertical axis the digitalization, where we say there are basically 3 categories. One, the traditional business model, not so much digital. Secondly, a mixed model, both kind of being digital and analog, particularly in the communication to the customer. And then we have a third group of companies where they would actually assess themselves as being fully digital. And on the other hand, we have, because on the previous trends I showed you in terms of globalization, wanted to know of where these companies see themselves in terms of local, regional, or global positions. And firstly, we asked them to position themselves at the present moment, being 2020, and secondly, ask them to position their strategic position of what they are aspiring to in 10 years. And we interviewed companies like the Swiss Family Hotel in Lenzerheide. We had Zeppelin interviewed. We have the Swiss Post. We had the luxury watch retailer Bucher, and also the employment agency Adecco, and also some logistics players. So smaller companies, but also very international companies. On the next chart, what I show you now, and I think it's not going to be surprise to you, but it's still, I think, quite impressive, I believe, if you see that, of what sort of push in terms of direction north, namely towards the digital models you see. I think a very interesting case is really Bucher, where they have acquired in the US Tourneau as a luxury brand retailer first, so to become really a genuine global player in luxury watches and luxury goods. And yet they are doing a very aggressive push now into digital models in reaching out to the customer in a digital way, and obviously also doing the omni sales channel, creating across the board. And it's also interesting and important for Bucher to see how customers actually talk in their social media, exchange information there. On the other hand, you see also Coop, obviously, and we have read the news yesterday of how well Migros and Coop have done with their e-commerce tools during the pandemic in their annual report last year, and obviously taken great strides to future roll out their e-commerce excellence. I allow myself a little bit of a critical word here to the strategy of the Swiss Post. You see, we had very interesting talks in terms when a traditional company is under pressure to reinvent the business model, because certain parts of their service portfolio are not being asked anymore. And obviously for the Swiss Post is particularly the distribution of letters, because this activity is kind of dwindling every year. And the strategy of Swiss Post is basically what we understood at the time twofold. Firstly, it's on the parcel distribution services, a possibility to regionalize, namely going into also a broader geographical area than only Switzerland, to look into the area of South Germany and North Italy, and concurrently also doing a big push in digitalization So actually to bring new business models in actually an acquisition a strategy of what we see, new services under the umbrella of the Swiss Post and going forward. And in terms of, you know, what we learned in the context of our book, I think it is quite challenging to do both at the same time, to expand your geographical footprint and also digitalize your business model concurrently and probably even entering new turf, because in the middle position here, the problematic area is that you might actually get competition from two sides. I mean, you from a digital side, you have certainly the competition from the pure players. We call them nightmare competitors from top down. On the other hand, geographically, you are not anymore as flexible as a small player, and yet you have then to fight against, you know, maybe the big international companies already with their footprints, and then going in with maybe more capital even into the digital strategy. And on the other hand, it was also very interesting and also an eye-opener to basically also learn that a very convincing niche strategy should also become successful even in digital ages if you have really a trusted customer base, if you know your customers well, and if you can also basically be very proud on your traditional values and bring them forward, you will absolutely have a chance in the future. I think what we learned in our research here, beware of the middle positions. There are different strategies possible, and you see in summary also the digital push going forward. I'm a little bit late. I'm just, Teresa, is it okay if I continue for 5 minutes? I believe so.
Yeah, it's fine for 5 minutes, but then just to come to a conclusion so we can ask the questions.
Yeah, okay. So I will go a little bit quicker. Sorry, this is a jump. It's low, sorry. With this digital ecosystem, and here I just want to quickly, and you also know this fact, but I really would like to make a point. I think for Europe and also Switzerland, you know, we are not entering this race with a natural advantage. I think US and China obviously have led the way. I think the reciprocity with the market access, I think it's not only geographical and geopolitical reasoned, but I would strongly argue that there's a strong commercial reason for that. I mean, if you have a big market closed up and you actually can foster your ecosystems, that's going to be a natural advantage. And digital, as we have seen, digital business models are not being invented by the day. They need investments and you need to have a certain security of market continuing. And I think for Europe, obviously, as we have not a big tech company, that might be a natural disadvantage. Also, digital ecosystems, just to illustrate, you know, this was also on my last visit to China 2 years ago. Obviously, the American suit for social media is banned. I don't think for not only for geopolitical reasons, but also certainly also for commercial reasons. I think that's also something to consider in Europe and US and China. And the hope obviously will be that this is opening up soon again. Now, the trading blocks, these fundamental trends are here to stay. I would really argue market access, reciprocity, trade deficit, you know, hopefully it's going to be a little bit kind of flattening, but there is a fact at the present moment. I show you just a chart. And also now in the digital age is this technological decoupling of which system actually are taking where your data are stored. We have kind of a forming of an infrastructure around trade zones and enter now coronavirus crisis and this new priority about self-sufficiency for certain goods and value chains. I think it's just an additional kind of reason why probably, you know, partners and friendly countries are clubbing together in a way we have not seen in the kind of best days of globalization between the 80s and 2010. So something to watch for Switzerland. So I will go quickly over this one. I think you know the trade deficit between US and China. Teresa already has alluded to the tariffs being imposed, but also here just one word. We have seen now also the new administration, Biden coming in, and we have not seen, at least there's no more increase about tariffs, but unfortunately there's also no decline in tariffs at the present moment, and no you know, convincing quest that we would go back to the original situation like 3-4 years ago. This is my second last chart here. We have other panels talking about this, but it's still a point I would like to just highlight. You know, for Switzerland, kind of, you know, searching the way between being in splendid isolation and playing a niche market and being everybody's darling, or actually whether there needs to be a considerate strategy towards some partnering, you know. And I think the world has changed. I think this is really important to reckon. You obviously, this is a example of the South China Sea in Asia. For Switzerland, you know, it's maybe some companies can say it's very relevant, others less so, but it is a clear illustration of how commercial trade interests are kind of now being kind of brought over to security interest in terms of logistics, and this exchange in the South China Sea going forward is something we have to watch. And you know, it's interesting to see really on the left hand side these trade and economic groupings around US, Mexico, Canada. You have then the ASEAN and you have the CPTPP, Australia, Chile, Japan, New Zealand, and Peru. On the other hand, you have now forming on an international level a Five Eyes Quad, again in the interest zone of South China Sea. And I would argue here, you know, we do really see emerging of trade and security interests. And also this is a fact we have to reckon, that probably partnering is something Switzerland really should clearly consider in future strategy. And I think it's also important for companies to being aware that probably the kind of hand-in-hand approach, also some strategy approach going forward into new territories might actually be quite important to have some kind of state support. All right, my last chart here, and then I come to the summary, will be the COVID impact on global trade. You know, the coronavirus has clearly given in certain areas like health, energy, but also vaccines, obviously, the priority to the countries to provide the security to their own citizen. And I think also this will be impetus on this first point, that we probably see some kind of self-sufficiency around trading blocks or trading zones, US, China, Europe. In terms of data management, the new gold in digital age, for me, it's almost like a fact that we see some kind of technological decoupling. There's almost like, I don't see really a reasonable way going back at the present moment that we have a flat world. I think data is going to be being guarded by fraud, as we have seen for commercial reasons, but also for geopolitical interests. So we might have a decoupling there. And this is also another consequence. I would put up the thesis that probably you know that we have a rejuvenation of the World Trade Organization. So one country, one voice. It's not going to happen very lightly and very soon. Size matters in cross-border negotiations, and I think that is particularly a very important consideration for Switzerland in going forward and plot the economic strategy going forward. So in summing up, I think this geopolitical rivalry between US and China is here to stay. Observe these ecosystems. It's not only about power and military, it's about commerce in particular. And I think it's important for Europe and Switzerland to clarify the strategy in this respect. Future business models, very clearly, millennial customers are the key focus. And the coronavirus has actually pushed this momentum up. Based on our book and some other research, we would argue middle positions here in terms of analog, traditional business model and digital. Beware, be very sensitive, be very critical when you are going this way. I think positioning is very important. Probably a focus on the business model of your business first, and then strive for a digital excellence. And the conclusions for Switzerland, being in a small country, they are somewhat in a difficult position. I think we see the scale up, particularly also in the banking side. You know, if you have one specific law in a country which is not easily being adopted by other countries, if you have different languages, this scale up is not so easy. And also from this side, small ecosystems need to partner. And I would say, as a battle cry, I think for Switzerland, in digital age, look out for this new trend. And I think it's important to clarify the stand there and plot a good strategy for the future generation and for the future business model. With that, I sum up and I hand over to you, Teresa.